I want everyone to witness this. This man just sat down at my table like he belongs here. You won't last 3 minutes in a room like this.
Then start counting.
The glass conservatory on the 52nd floor of the Solara Tower glittered like something out of a dream, champagne in crystal flutes, Dallas sprawling beneath them like a map of money. Darius Bell had just finished fixing the building's cooling system when he lowered himself into an empty chair at the edge of the room just for a moment, just to breathe. That was when Sabrina Westbrook noticed him. She walked over slowly, heels clicking against polished marble, and looked him up and down without a word. The scuffed boots, the worn jacket, the calloused hands resting on the white tablecloth. Then she turned to her guests and raised her champagne flute. "I want everyone to witness this," she said, her voice carrying easily over the music. "This man just sat down at my table like he belongs here." She glanced back at Darius, her smile sharpening. "You won't last 3 minutes in a room like this." The laughter came fast. Someone pulled out their phone. Darius didn't flinch. He pulled the chair closer and said, "Then start counting." If you're new here, this is the kind of story we tell on this channel. Hit subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. The laughter didn't last long. It never does when the person being laughed at refuses to move. Darius Bell kept his eyes on Sabrina Westbrook for a moment longer, not with anger, not with the wide, apologetic look she was clearly expecting. Then he turned away and rested his hands flat on the tablecloth as if the whole thing had already passed him by. The room settled back into its murmur of cocktail conversation, but something had shifted. The air felt different. A few guests glanced over their shoulders at him. One woman leaned toward the man beside her and whispered something behind her hand. Sabrina returned to her circle near the center of the conservatory champagne flute, back in her grip, her posture unchanged. She had built an entire career on the ability to appear unaffected, and tonight was no different. Westbrook Nexus had taken 15 years to become what it was, a technology company that didn't just build systems. It redesigned the logic of how cities breathed. Smart infrastructure data, pipelines running beneath streets and across power grids. The kind of invisible engineering that made modern urban life function without anyone noticing. She had pitched it, funded it, fought for it in boardrooms full of men who smiled at her like she was a pleasant distraction, and she had won. Tonight was the culmination of all of it, the formal unveiling of her most ambitious project, yet a proposal to transform 3 American cities into fully integrated smart environments, a contract worth more than anyone in this room would name out loud. She had planned every detail of this evening down to the angle of the lighting. She was not the kind of woman who left things to chance, which was exactly why the man in the worn jacket bothered her more than she wanted to admit. Darius had arrived at the Solara Tower a little after 4 in the afternoon, 2 hours before the first guests were due. The conservatory's HVAC system had been throwing error codes since the previous night, temperature irregularities, pressure fluctuations in the water, circulation lines that fed the automated misting system running along the glass ceiling. Without that system, the room would turn into a greenhouse by 8 o'clock. The event coordinator, a thin man named Gerald, who communicated almost entirely in clipped sentences and stressed vowels, had called the building's regular maintenance crew first. They hadn't picked up. He had worked his way down a list and ended up at Darius. Darius had seen worse. He spent most of his days moving through the older residential buildings in Oak Cliff, cracked pipes, failing boilers, wiring that hadn't been touched since the 1980s. He carried his tools in a duffel bag that had been repaired with duct tape twice over, and he knew how to read a system by sound before he ever opened a panel. He found the fault within 40 minutes, a secondary pressure regulator that had been installed incorrectly during a renovation the previous spring, creating a slow buildup that the system's sensors kept flagging without the root cause ever being addressed. He corrected it, ran a full diagnostic, and had everything stabilized by 6:15. Gerald had looked at the restored readings on his tablet and exhaled like a man who had just been told he didn't need surgery after all. Then he had asked Darius to stay, just in case, he said, just through the event. He offered an additional $200 on top of the flat rate, and Darius, who had a 9-year-old son at home and a stack of medical bills that had been thinning his bank account for 2 years, said yes. Miles was with Mrs. Patterson next door, a retired schoolteacher who lived alone and never seemed to mind. Darius had called before the event started, and Miles had answered on the second ring the way he always did, like he'd been sitting next to the phone waiting. His son's voice was the clearest thing in Darius's day always had been. Even on the worst days, the days when the jobs ran long and the pay ran short, and the weight of doing everything alone settled across his shoulders like something physical, Miles's voice cut through it. They talked for 4 minutes. Miles told him about a drawing he'd been working on a suspension bridge over an imaginary river. Darius told him he'd be home before breakfast. He meant it. He had settled into the chair at the edge of the room simply because there was nowhere else to go. The maintenance area on the floor below had been locked after Gerald left, and the conservatory was technically open. He wasn't seated at the main tables. He had chosen a chair near the outer wall, half behind a large sculptural planter, far from the center of anything. He had no intention of being noticed. He planned to rest for 20 minutes, then find a quiet corner near the mechanical room and wait out the rest of the evening. I had not planned on Sabrina Westbrook. She had a way of scanning a room that most people probably mistook for casual observation. It wasn't. Darius had seen it in the moment she crossed toward him, the slight angle of her chin, the sweep of her eyes that took inventory before it took interest. He had worked in enough high-end buildings to recognize it. It was the look of someone who had trained themselves to identify anything that didn't belong, the way a property manager walks through a lobby and clocks the scuff on the baseboard before they see the flowers on the front desk. Sabrina Westbrook saw him and made a decision about him in under 3 seconds. The walk across the marble floor, the slow look up and down the raised champagne flute, all of it was deliberate, all of it was performance, and all of it was designed to make him feel like something to be removed. He had heard variations of that speech his entire life. Different words, different rooms, different faces, but the same sentence underneath all of it. You don't belong here. Prove it by leaving. He had heard it in high school when his family moved from one side of Dallas to another, and the school district changed with it. He had heard it in hospital waiting rooms, in leasing offices, in the faces of people who asked what he did for a living, and then found somewhere else to look. He was 36 years old, and he knew that particular kind of dismissal the way a person knows the sound of their own name. What Sabrina Westbrook didn't know, couldn't know. Standing there in her architect-designed conservatory with her curated guest list, and her billion-dollar announcement was that Darius Bell had stopped leaving. He had made that decision a long time ago, quietly, without announcement. It wasn't bitterness that had led him there. His wife, Renee, had died 3 years earlier from a brain aneurysm that no one had seen coming here one morning gone by afternoon, leaving behind a medical debt that multiplied into something much larger. A 6-year-old boy who had stopped talking for 6 weeks, and a silence in their apartment that Darius had spent months learning to live inside. The grief had not made him hard. If anything, it had stripped him down to something clearer. He understood now what mattered and what didn't. He understood that a man's worth was not located in the room he could afford to sit in. And he understood that the moments when someone tried to shrink you were exactly the moments when you had to take up more space, not less, not out of pride, but because there were people watching who needed to see it done. Miles had asked him once, not long after Renee died, why people sometimes looked at them the way they did that specific look, the one that mixed pity with something colder. Darius hadn't answered right away. He'd been washing dishes, and he'd turned off the faucet and dried his hands and sat down across from his son at the kitchen table and said, "Some people decide what a person is worth before they've said a single word. And when someone does that to you, you've got 2 choices. You can let them be right, or you can just keep being exactly who you are until they run out of room to stand on." Miles had nodded slowly the way he did when he was filing something away for later. Darius hoped the lesson was landing. He was still trying to live it himself. So when Sabrina Westbrook raised her champagne glass and offered him to the room like a punchline, Darius did not stand up. He did not apologize for existing in that chair. He pulled it slightly closer to the table, a small, deliberate motion, and he looked at her with the full, quiet steadiness of a man who had already decided that her opinion of him had no authority over who he was. "Then start counting," he said. The room had expected him to fold. The laughter had anticipated his exit. Instead, the laughter faded unevenly, the way a song cuts out when someone pulls the wrong chord, and the guests near enough to hear found themselves looking at Sabrina, instead of Darius waiting to see what she would do with a man who had just declined to be dismissed. Sabrina looked at him for a moment, something flickering behind her expression that was too fast to name, and then she turned back to her guests with a smile that was perfectly intact. But across the conservatory, a few phones were still raised. A few people were still watching. And Darius sat where he was, hands flat on the white tablecloth, breathing steadily, waiting for the night to move forward. He had a son at home who was drawing bridges over imaginary rivers, and he had promised to be back before breakfast. He intended to keep that promise, but he was not leaving this room on someone else's terms. Not tonight. Not ever again. It started with a question about champagne. One of Sabrina's guests, a man named Holloway, silver-haired and wearing a watch that cost more than Darius earned in a year, drifted toward the outer wall with his drink and looked at Darius with the particular brand of curiosity that wasn't really curiosity at all. "Tell me," Holloway said, settling into a chair nearby as though conducting an informal interview, "do you even know what vintage they're pouring tonight?" His tone was pleasant conversational, the kind of voice that made condescension sound like small talk. Darius looked at the bottle on the nearest table. 2017, he said. "Good year for Blanc de Blancs, though I'd have gone with something a little less showy for a room trying this hard to look effortless." Holloway blinked. Someone nearby who had been listening let out a short laugh they quickly covered with a cough. That was how the evening changed shape. What had begun as an attempt to embarrass Darius became something else, a slow, uncomfortable discovery that the man they had dismissed wasn't playing the role they had written for him. A woman named Courtney, who sat on the board of 2 separate real estate development firms, asked him whether he understood what Westbrook Nexus was actually proposing with its Smart City initiative. She asked it the way a professor asks a student who has wandered into the wrong lecture hall. Darius said he understood the concept. Then he said something that made her set down her glass. "The problem with most smart city proposals," he said, "is that they're designed by people who've never had to wait 45 minutes for a bus at 2 in the morning. You can optimize traffic flow and energy consumption all you want, but if the people who actually live in those cities can't afford the rent once the development money moves in, you haven't built a smarter city. You've built a more efficient one for a different set of people." Courtney opened her mouth and then closed it. Holloway turned his watch over on his wrist. Across the room, Sabrina had not moved, but she was listening. Darius could tell by the slight angle of her head. I wasn't performing. That was what confused them. He thought they expected defensiveness, or deflection, or the over-eager agreeableness of someone trying to prove they deserved to be in the room. What they got instead was a man who had spent years working inside the bones of buildings like this one, who understood infrastructure not as a concept, but as something physical, something that failed at 3 in the morning, in neighborhoods where the repair crews took longer to arrive, who had thought carefully about these things because they were not abstractions to him. They were the walls around his son's bedroom. They were the heating unit that had broken twice last winter. They were the bus route Miles took to school. Sabrina said nothing during this stretch of the evening. She moved through her guests with practiced ease, refilling conversations, redirecting attention, doing what she had always done in rooms like this, maintaining control of the atmosphere. But twice Darius caught her looking at him from across the conservatory with an expression he couldn't fully read. Not amusement, not irritation. Something that sat between the two, uncomfortable and unresolved. It was just past 10:30 when the temperature in the room began to rise. It happened gradually at first. A few guests loosening collars, a woman fanning herself with a program card, and then the misting system overhead made a sound like a cough and went quiet. Within minutes, the automated display near the entrance flashed a warning indicator, and Gerald appeared from a side corridor, moving faster than Darius had seen him move all evening. The event coordinator pulled out his tablet, jabbed at it twice, and then looked up at the ceiling with an expression that meant the tablet had not helped. The building's primary HVAC team was unreachable. It was past 10 o'clock. The on-call technician wasn't answering, and the backup number went to voicemail. Water was beginning to seep from a joint in the overhead irrigation line, dropping in slow, scattered beads onto the polished floor near the east wall. One of the catering staff placed a linen napkin over the spot, which solved nothing and made the problem more visible. Guests were starting to notice. The atmosphere that Sabrina had spent weeks calibrating was beginning to come apart at the seams. Darius was already on his feet. He hadn't waited to be asked. He crossed to the mechanical access panel on the north wall, opened it, and ran his eyes across the system display. What he saw confirmed what he had suspected the moment the misting system cut out. The fault wasn't in the central controller, which was what Gerald kept pointing at, and it wasn't in the primary water line. It was in the secondary pressure valve on the east irrigation branch, the same type of installation error he had corrected in the main system earlier that afternoon, likely done by the same crew during the same renovation. The valve had been torqued too tight on installation and had been slowly failing under the evening's sustained load. Now it had given out entirely, redirecting water pressure back through the overhead line. He turned to the two maintenance staff members Gerald had pulled from somewhere below and walked them through it in clear, unhurried language. Isolate the east branch valve. Manually override the pressure balance on the secondary line. Bring the system down to minimum circulation until the joint could be properly sealed. It took 11 minutes. Not because it was complicated, but because one of the staff members had never worked that particular system before and needed each step confirmed before he moved. Darius stayed patient. He didn't raise his voice. When the misting system came back online and the temperature in the room began to level out, Gerald exhaled and typed something into his tablet with the intensity of a man filing a near-disaster report in real time. The guests who had clustered near the windows drifted back toward the center. Someone started a new conversation about the proposal. The evening reassembled itself around the crisis as though it had never happened the way expensive events always do. Sabrina stood near the main presentation wall and watched Darius close the access panel. She had not moved during the 11 minutes. She had stood exactly where she was and watched the whole thing, and now she was looking at him the way she might look at a column of numbers that had resolved into something she hadn't expected. The man she had pointed at 3 hours ago and offered to the room as a joke had just saved her event. Not metaphorically. Literally. And he hadn't asked for recognition, hadn't looked around to see who was watching. He had simply seen what needed to be done and done it, and now he was walking back toward his chair at the edge of the room with the same quiet steadiness he'd carried all evening. Sabrina set down her champagne glass for the first time that night. She found him 20 minutes later near the outer wall where he'd been sitting since the beginning. She came alone without her guests, and she stood in front of him rather than looking past him, which was already different from anything she had done all evening. "I want to add a bonus to your payment for tonight," she said. "On top of the rate Gerald agreed on, for what you just handled." She named a figure, $500, and the way she said it was careful, deliberate, like an offering made through a slot in a wall. Darius looked at her. "Gerald's rate was fair," he said. "I'll take what we agreed on." Sabrina hadn't expected that. She had expected gratitude or negotiation or at minimum the slight softening that money usually produced. "You did more than what was agreed on," she said. Darius kept his eyes on hers, steady and unhurried. "I did what the situation needed. That's not extra, that's just the job." She stood there for the moment, recalibrating. Then, because she didn't know what else to do with her hands, she sat down in the chair across from him, not to make a point, but simply because the conversation wasn't going to go the way she'd planned, and she needed to be at eye level for whatever came next. The shift was small but real, and both of them felt it. "You have a son," she said. It wasn't a question. She had overheard him mention it to one of the catering staff earlier. "Miles," Darius said. "He's 9. Something in his expression shifted, not softer exactly, but warmer, the way a room changes when someone turns on a lamp. He told her that Miles liked to draw buildings. Bridges, especially suspension bridges over rivers that didn't exist yet, designed for cities he invented on graph paper. He told her that Miles was the kind of kid who looked at a skyline and saw possibility, except that lately he'd started saying something that Darius couldn't shake. "The prettiest places aren't for people like us, Dad." 9 years old, and already he had absorbed that particular lesson from somewhere from the accumulated weight of 100 small moments that Darius hadn't been able to intercept in time. Sabrina said nothing. But something in her face changed in a way she couldn't school back into neutrality fast enough. A brief, unguarded expression that moved across her features before she could decide what to do with it. Because she knew that sentence. Not from a child, but from herself 20 years ago, standing outside a boardroom where she hadn't been invited, telling herself that the people inside knew something she didn't, that the distance between her and that room was permanent and deserved. She had spent 2 decades building an empire specifically so she would never have to feel that way again. And tonight, without thinking, she had said an almost identical thing to a man sitting quietly in a chair. She opened her mouth to say something. Before she could find the words, Gerald appeared at her elbow with his tablet and a look that meant something had gone wrong in a different direction entirely. The video had been posted 43 minutes ago. By the time Gerald showed Sabrina the screen, it had been shared more than 12,000 times. The clip was 18 seconds long, her walking across the marble floor, the slow look up and down the raised champagne glass, the line delivered to the room. I give him 3 minutes before he realizes he's in the wrong room. Whoever had filmed it had captured the laughter clearly. They had also captured Darius's face, steady, dignified, undisturbed, which made Sabrina look considerably worse than the words alone. Her communications director called within minutes. Then 2 board members. Then her publicist who spoke in the clipped, rapid sentences of someone already in damage control mode. The message from all of them was essentially the same, just differently packaged. This needed to go away quickly, and the cleanest path was to reframe the narrative. Say that Darius had been in a restricted area. Say there had been a misunderstanding about access. Let the company's legal team issue a brief statement about venue security protocols and the story would lose its oxygen before morning. Sabrina stood in the corridor outside the conservatory and listened to her publicist lay out the strategy in precise, efficient terms. It was a good strategy, technically. It was the kind of strategy that worked. Through the glass wall of the corridor, she could see Darius. He had retrieved his duffel bag from beside the chair and was pulling on his worn jacket, methodical and unhurried, the same way he did everything. He had heard enough. She could tell by the particular quality of his stillness, not the stillness of someone at rest, but the stillness of someone who has just confirmed something they already knew. He wasn't angry. He was just done being surprised by it. She watched him walk toward the elevator. The doors opened. He stepped inside. In the moment before they closed, he glanced back at the conservatory, not at her, not at the guests, not at any particular thing. Just a last look at the room, the way a person looks at a place they are leaving and have no plans to return to. Then the doors shut, and he was gone. Sabrina's publicist was still talking. She lowered the phone from her ear and stood in the corridor alone, and for the first time in a very long time, she felt something she didn't have a strategy for. It wasn't guilt exactly. Guilt implied surprise, and somewhere beneath the evening's careful surface, she had known from the moment she raised that glass exactly what she was doing. What she felt was something heavier and less manageable. It was the recognition that she had become at some unmarked point in the years between struggling and succeeding precisely the kind of person she had once needed protecting from. And tonight, with the whole room laughing and the phones raised and the elevator doors closing on a man who had done nothing but sit in a chair and fix her building. She had proven it clearly enough that 12,000 strangers on the internet had already agreed. Her publicist finished the sentence. So, do we move forward with the statement? Sabrina looked at the closed elevator doors for a long moment. I'll call you back, she said and hung up. Darius got home at 5:15 in the morning. The apartment was quiet in the way that only early mornings are quiet. Not empty, but held like the whole building was breathing slowly. Mrs. Patterson had left a light on in the hallway the way she always did, and Miles was asleep on the couch with a blanket pulled up to his chin and a sketchbook open on the floor beside him. Darius stood in the doorway for a moment and looked at his son. The sketchbook page was filled with pencil lines, a long, elegant bridge suspended over water, the cables drawn with the kind of careful repetition that meant Miles had erased and redrawn them more than once. At the bottom of the page in his son's handwriting, he had written a name for the bridge. He had named it after their street. Darius set down his duffel bag without making a sound. covered the sketchbook with the edge of the blanket so the pages wouldn't curl, and went to the kitchen to start the coffee. He was exhausted in a way that went past the physical, the particular depletion that comes not from hard work, but from the sustained effort of keeping your dignity intact in a room that is actively trying to take it from you. He had done it. He knew he had done it. But knowing it didn't make him feel triumphant. It made him feel tired and clear in equal measure, the way you feel after a long drive through difficult weather when you finally pull into the driveway and turn off the engine. By 7 o'clock, the story had spread in the way that stories do when they hit the particular nerve of something people already believed but hadn't found a clean example of yet. The clip had been viewed more than 200,000 times. The comment sections were splitting in the way comment sections always split: one half, outraged on Darius's behalf, one half constructing alternate explanations, and a vocal third contingent that had decided the most interesting question was not what Sabrina had done, but what Darius's presence in that room meant, whether he had been looking for attention, whether the whole thing was staged. People who had never met him were writing confident paragraphs about his motivations. A blogger had already published a piece titled "The Man Who Wouldn't Leave," which was sympathetic in a way that made Darius sound like a symbol rather than a person. Miles woke up and found his father at the kitchen table with both hands around his coffee mug, staring at nothing in particular. "You're home," Miles said with the specific satisfaction of a child whose expectation has been met. Darius told him, yes, he was home. Miles climbed into the chair across from him, pulled his sketchbook from where he'd retrieved it off the couch, and continued drawing without asking any further questions, which was one of the things Darius loved most about his son. Miles understood the difference between presence and conversation, and he understood that sometimes his father needed one without the other. They ate breakfast together. Miles had cereal. Darius made eggs and didn't eat half of them. Outside, the morning was already warm in the specific dry way of a Dallas July, and the neighborhood was coming alive in increments. A car starting someone's screen door, the distant compression of a garbage truck working its way up the block. Darius looked at his son drawing bridges at the kitchen table and thought about what was waiting for him on his phone, and he thought about the woman who had watched him walk into that elevator and had not said a word to stop him. He had expected that. He had not walked into that elevator believing anything different was coming. People with that much to lose rarely chose the harder thing. He had made his peace with it on the way down, watching the floor numbers descend, thinking about Miles's bridge and the coffee he was going to make when he got home. What he had not expected, what arrived as a genuine surprise, the kind that takes a moment to process, was the call he received at 9:47 that morning from a number he didn't know, which turned out to be Sabrina Westbrook's personal cell. She had not slept. He could tell from her voice, not disheveled exactly, but stripped of the particular polish it had carried all evening, like a surface with the lacquer sanded off. She didn't open with an explanation or a disclaimer. She said his name, confirmed he was on the line, and then said, "I'm not calling to manage this. I want you to know that first." He said nothing, and she continued. "My team gave me a way out last night. I could have made this about access permissions and venue security, and it probably would have worked. I didn't take it. I'm holding a press conference at 11 o'clock, and I'm going to say exactly what happened." She told him she wasn't calling to ask his permission because what she had done wasn't something she could undo by asking. She was calling because he deserved to hear it from her directly before he heard it from a news alert. Darius set down his coffee mug. Across the table, Miles was still drawing his pencil, moving in long, careful strokes. "All right," Darius said. "I also want to talk to you," Sabrina said. "Not today, if you're not ready. But I want to talk about something real, not a check and a handshake." He asked her what she meant by real. She said she wasn't entirely sure yet, but that she'd spent the last 4 hours thinking about what he'd said about the cities, about the people designing them and the people living in them. And she thought she might have been building something with a very large blind spot in it, and she would like to understand that better. She said it plainly, without the rhetorical architecture of a prepared statement, and that plainness was what made Darius believe her at least enough to stay on the line. "I'll hear you out," he said. "But I want to be direct with you about something first." She said, "Go ahead." "I'm not interested in being a story your company tells about itself. I'm not interested in a donation or a photo or my name on something. If this is about making Westbrook Nexus look better, I'm the wrong person to call. There was quiet on the line, not the silence of offense, but the silence of someone absorbing a sentence they needed time to sit with. Then Sabrina said, "That's fair, and I'm not going to pretend I don't have a company to answer to because I do, but I'm asking if we can start from something honest and see what it becomes." Darius said he could agree to that much. The press conference lasted 22 minutes. Sabrina stood at a podium in the Westbrook Nexus lobby with no statement cards in front of her and played the full clip, not the edited 18 seconds that had been circulating, but the complete recording, which included the moment Darius had fixed the system and the conversation afterward and his quiet walk to the elevator. She identified him by name. She said he had arrived at her event to do a job, had done it with more competence and dignity than anyone else in the room, and had been treated as an intrusion rather than a person. She said the framing she had been offered by her own team, the one about access and venue security, was a lie she had chosen not to tell, and that choosing not to tell it was the least she could do, and probably still not enough. She did not cry. She did not perform remorse. She spoke in the same direct, clear register she used in quarterly earnings calls, which made the acknowledgement feel more serious rather than less, because it was clearly costing her something. A reporter near the front asked whether she was concerned about the impact on the Smart City proposal. Sabrina said the proposal would stand or fall on its merits, and that if it couldn't survive her telling the truth about her own behavior, it probably deserved to fall. The clip of the press conference reached more people than the original video. Holloway, the silver-haired man with the expensive watch, quietly removed a social media post he had made the previous night that had described the evening as eventful in the best way. Darius met with Sabrina 10 days later in a conference room at Westbrook Nexus that looked out over downtown Dallas. He brought a notepad. She had cleared 2 hours and told her assistant to hold everything. They talked for 3.5 hours, and the conversation was not comfortable, which meant it was probably productive. He told her things about how infrastructure actually functioned in the neighborhoods. Her proposals were targeting not as complaint, but as information. The kind of granular, specific lived knowledge that doesn't appear in feasibility studies or investor decks. She listened without the performance of listening, without the slight forward lean that means someone is waiting for their turn to speak. She asked questions that were specific rather than broad, which told him she was actually processing what he said rather than filing it away for later use. When she finally laid out what she had in mind, she was direct about it. A workforce initiative embedded within the Westbrook Nexus expansion program focused specifically on skilled tradespeople who had been locked out of advancement by debt credential gaps or caregiving responsibilities. Not a grant program, not a scholarship fund with her name on the building. A structured employment pipeline with fair wages, on-site childcare at participating facilities, and a genuine promotion track. She wanted him to help design the operational framework, not as a consultant brought in for appearances, but as someone who understood the problem from the inside and would be paid accordingly for his expertise. Darius looked at the outline she had prepared. It was rough, she had said so herself, but it was structural rather than decorative, and that distinction mattered. He told her what was missing. He told her that any program targeting single parents needed to account for the specific arithmetic of caregiving, that a training schedule designed around a standard 9 to 5 assumed a support system that many of these families didn't have, and that if the child care provision wasn't flexible, it would fail within the first enrollment cycle. He told her that the wages in her draft were livable but not competitive, and that if she wanted people with real skills, she needed to pay for real skills. He told her that he had one condition before he agreed to anything: the program could not be named after him or marketed as his story or used in any external communications without his explicit approval of the specific language. "I'm not a testimonial," he said. Sabrina said she understood. She changed the name in the document while he was sitting there crossing out the working title with a pen. "What do you want to call it?" she asked. Darius thought for a moment. "Bell Works," he said. "Not because of me, because that's what it's supposed to do. Work." A year later, on a Tuesday morning in early June, the first Bell Works training center opened in Oak Cliff, 4 blocks from the apartment where Darius and Miles had lived since Renee died. The building was not new. It had been a vacant community center, renovated rather than rebuilt, which had been Darius's specific recommendation. because he felt that the neighborhood deserved a building that had roots in it, rather than one that arrived from outside with fresh paint and the smell of displacement. The ceremony was small by Westbrook Nexus standards. No branded displays, no prepared speeches on teleprompters. Folding chairs on a concrete floor, coffee in paper cups, and about 60 people who had either enrolled in the program's first cohort or come to watch someone they knew walk through the doors. Miles stood beside his father in his good sneakers and a button-down shirt he had ironed himself because Darius had taught him how to do it, and he took the skill seriously. He looked at the sign above the entrance for a long time, Bell Works Training Center, Oak Cliff, and then he looked at the building itself, and then at the people going in and out. And Darius watched his son's face move through something he recognized as recalibration, as the quiet revision of a belief that had been sitting in him for a few years. That the best places weren't built for people like them. Miles didn't say anything about it out loud. He didn't need to. Darius could see it in the way his son's shoulders settled. A reporter from a local outlet found Sabrina near the entrance and asked whether she still thought about what she'd said that night at the conservatory, the 3 minutes, the raised glass, all of it. Sabrina looked across the room at Darius, who was talking to one of the program's first graduates, a woman who had spent 6 years doing unlicensed electrical work in her building because no one in the formal sector would hire her without a certificate she couldn't afford to get. Then she looked back at the reporter. "I thought he didn't belong in my room," she said. "What I understand now is that the room didn't deserve him." Darius heard it from across the space. He didn't respond. He reached down and took Miles's hand, and his son leaned slightly into his arm, the way he had since he was small, and they stood together in the building that bore their name without bearing his story. In the neighborhood that had shaped everything about who he was, in a city that was slowly, imperfectly learning to be built for the people who actually lived in it. He had stayed all night in a room that had tried to make him small. He had done it not to prove anything to Sabrina Westbrook, not to win an audience, not to become anyone's lesson. He had done it because his son was 9 years old and drawing bridges to places that didn't exist yet, and someone had to show him that the distance between here and there was crossable. Not by luck, not by the grace of someone powerful deciding to be generous, but by the quiet, durable refusal to accept that the door was ever really closed. There's a version of this story where Darius walks out after 3 minutes, where he decides it isn't worth it, goes home, and nobody ever knows his name. But he didn't. And the reason he didn't wasn't anger or ambition or the hope that someone powerful might notice him. It was simpler than that. He had a son at home who was watching not in that room but in every room that came after, and he wanted Miles to know that dignity isn't something other people hand you. It's something you carry in and refuse to put down no matter who asks you to. If this story stayed with you, subscribe to the channel. Every week we bring you stories like this one about ordinary people who hold the line when it would have been so much easier not to. You don't want to miss the next one.